Thank you so much, and grateful to the Mack Institute team and to all of our panelists. Hopefully, this will be a insightful discussion and a chance for us to dig into something incredibly timely and topical. As Valerie mentioned, my name is Ali Zaidi. I'm a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and my research and teaching is really aimed at this intersection of energy, materials, and AI. I'm thrilled to be joined in this conversation for the latest in the Mack Institute's webinar series. Like Mack, so many of us across the Penn campus are focused on how technologies can transform industries, reshape ecosystems, and challenge business models, and how we take on all of that in a way that is responsible, sustainable, and resilient. And as Valerie mentioned, and is obvious to all of you joining, there's perhaps no greater technological shift happening right now than the rapid rise of Gen AI. When we talk about artificial intelligence, we often speak in metaphors. We treat artificial intelligence as an abstract thing out there that's shaping all of the macro environment. But there's a very stone cold physical reality to all of this. The atoms, the molecules, the energy, the thermodynamics, the steel that's going into the ground. And we're here with a chance to really dig into how the AI economy is anchored to these physical realities. Every time folks at home, they ask AI to write a document or summarize a meeting or generate an image. There's a whole cluster of high-powered silicon chips miles away that pull immense power from our electrical grid. They radiate intense heat, and they often require millions of gallons of water just to keep from melting and be able to continue to do that. So today we'll dive into those physical realities and their implications for individuals, for firms, and for our economy. And to understand that, first, to really dig into the brains of these operations, we've got my dear colleague, Professor Ben Lee, who's a professor of electrical and systems engineering and computer information science here at Penn Engineering. He also brings an insider view of the tech giants driving this revolution. He's serving as a visiting researcher at Google's Global Infrastructure Group and has worked extensively with Meta AI. Ben's research, which I think is amazing, includes leadership of path-breaking multi-year NSF-backed center, and is really focused, among many other things, it's very multivariate, computer architecture and how cloud data centers can be designed to be radically more efficient. So grateful to have him join us. Next, we have a chance to look at how this infrastructure plugs into the economy. And for that, I'm joined by my colleague, Professor Serguei Netessine. Serguei is the Dhirubhai Ambani Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship here at the Wharton School. He's a world-renowned expert on operational excellence and risk-driven business models. And sort of most relevantly and recently, his work has gone real deep and I think in a trenchant way, examined the energy transition, including how mobile and stationary energy storage, which if you hear about chips, you probably also are hearing a bunch about batteries, can reshape our electrical grids. He's here to help us understand how the supply chain risks, the grid constraints, and the economic ripple effects really are manifesting as this AI boom takes place. So we're grateful to have him. And then from the industry perspective, and really to sort of help us talk through the physical innovations happening on factory floors and in data center builds, like in the build themselves. We're thrilled to welcome Govi Rao. Govi's the CEO of Phase Change Solutions. He's a highly accomplished ESG and green tech entrepreneur. He's spent his entire career dedicated to scaling sustainability transitions, pioneering the push to scale commercial LED lighting, to now inventing literal smart materials that absorb and manage heat passively in data centers. So Gavi can give us both the sort of materials view, but also, which I'm personally very obsessed about, but also just give us more of a sense from the front lines of commercial clean tech. So we're grateful to have him here as well. So we'll proceed. We're going to dive in. We have a few areas I want to make sure we definitely touch in this conversation. And then, as Valerie mentioned, an opportunity to dig into Q&A from there. So let's start out just sort of the base foundation that everybody, I think, needs to have to engage in this conversation as informed folks who can interrogate beyond the headlines of what we're reading, the hardware and architecture. Really, let's set the scene here. And for that, I want to pull Ben in. For about 50 years, the tech industry's lived by Moore's Law, this predictable rule that computer chips would double in speed and cut in cost every 2 years. It worked like clockwork, but over time we shrank those transistors down to just a few nanometers, literally a few atoms across, which is hard to process. And in some ways, this traditional chip progress has flattened out, largely due to thermal management challenges of trapped heat. Around that same time is when this Gen AI movement really has taken place. And unlike the standard app that executes one task after the other, as hopefully some of the audience knows, AI demands billions of calculations all at the same time. So a tremendous amount of structural change happening in a very short period of time. So Ben, want you, for the audience, to really sort of pull the curtain back for us. Walk us through this industry pivot away from traditional chips to GPUs. Talk us through what this means for the way we actually design data centers.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you so much for setting the stage, Ali. Definitely decades-long trends in semiconductor technology have slowed, if not ended, and we're looking for new strategies to deliver the computation that AI demands from us. I would begin by saying that data centers are not new in the sense that they've been around for at least 20 years. They've been serving us search queries. They've been serving us content via streaming platforms, serving us through social media platforms. So these data centers have existed for a very long time. The difficulty has been that with generative AI coming along, generative AI requires a very specific type of computation, the computation on matrices and tensors. And it turns out that the chips that we have been using for all of our data center computing in the past are not particularly well suited to matrix and tensor algebra. And for that reason, we've seen this massive pivot towards graphics processing units, or GPUs, that are. Right? These GPUs were originally designed to render video games, and now they're great at doing matrix calculations and tensor calculations. That's why we see this massive shift towards GPUs. Now, with this shift, there have been several significant implications. The first is that these GPUs draw a lot more power. They do a lot more compute, but they also draw a lot more power than classical CPU chips. So we need to figure out how to deploy these and power these chips in an effective and sustainable way. The second is that these GPUs, because they're dealing with such massive amounts of data and massively large models, they need to coordinate and collaborate together to calculate a shared answer. And that's why all of these GPUs have to go into a single facility. The GPUs in these facilities have gone a lot larger than they have in the past because we want that tight coupling, with that tight coordination between those chips. And once you put that many chips drawing that much power into a single facility, you're going to have to figure out how to cool all the heat that's generated, or manage all the heat that's generated by those chips. So this has been a significant sea change in the computational load, but also the systems that we need to build. And this has implications for how we design the chips and the memory systems, This has implications of delivering power and thermal management, and then scheduling workloads. So this is an incredibly exciting time to be thinking about server design and data center design.
That's great. And you've walked us a little bit through that um, data center in our mind now, right? Walking through the server racks, why we need to pile all this stuff into one place, what the implications are a bit for heat. One of the things that comes up in the analysis and commentary, whether you're looking at it from a finance perspective, policy, or otherwise, is this difference between AI training versus inference. And also how hyperscalers are starting to think dynamically about the allocation of hardware. Um, peel into that a little bit. I'm curious how you think about the.
Right. So when we think about the taxonomy or how we think about data centers and different and how they're used, training and inference is a great place to start. We need a lot of GPUs to train the models. Training means looking at the vast amounts of data, vast amounts of data on the internet, and learning the model parameters or the model values that will help us to get accurate predictions of the tokens that we want to generate, the characters that we want to generate. So that's training. But once a model's been trained, hopefully people find the model useful enough that we can that they will ask the model to do things for it. And that's the inference side. So there's the design and construction of the model, and then there's the use of the model, the training and the inference. Just a few years ago, we would have thought that most of the compute and most of the concern was around the training side because we were building these massive data centers to train frontier models. But we're seeing in the last year or two a real pivot towards building data centers for inference. As more users, as more software agents start asking AI to do things for them, we need GPUs that can actually respond to those requests, the massive volume of requests coming in per second, and also respond in a timely way. Within, say, 100 seconds, you should be seeing responses come out the other end of an AI model. So we are increasingly building data centers for inference. And the concern is that if AI becomes as successful as some of us hope, then the number of machines we need for inference will have to grow fairly significantly. And that's driving demand for machines and servers by Microsoft and Google and Amazon. These are companies that are building data centers, deploying lots of GPUs into them, and then essentially renting them out so that people can deploy models and run inference queries on them. The last thing I'll say is that inference and these machines can be used to serve user requests and software requests, but they can also serve existing software platforms. So you might have noticed that Google is increasingly connecting its AI Gemini models to the search engine, right? So these are what we call first-party workloads. These companies are developing their own internet services and they're connecting AI into it. So data centers will have to serve those sorts of existing internet services as well. So there's a really rich space of computation that these data centers are being built to serve and address.
Yeah, I think getting people to understand the different functionalities and not a monolith, and then helping sort of back out of that. What are then the operational implications? You talked about speed of response. That's the latency measure that might dictate sort of where the data center actually is placed. So it's, I think, really helpful for folks to think through that. One of the other areas you spend a lot of time is looking into emerging tech, new chips, different approaches to memory. Help us see around the corner a bit as the industry shift to GPUs had seismic implications for physical infrastructure. It's part of the reason we're here together today. What's the next big hardware shift?
I think we're seeing a lot more players in hardware design. Historically, we would have seen maybe one or two really big players in chip design, like Intel and AMD for the CPUs and NVIDIA for the GPUs. But now we see with all the resources that are being put into the building and construction of data centers, we see a lot of resources into in-house chip development. So Google is building its own chips, Meta is building its own chips, GPUs, CPUs. And as a result, because they're building custom chips for their workloads, they're able to get some energy efficiency out of that computation. Google's TPUs might be more energy efficient than an off-the-shelf NVIDIA GPU. So I think that there's this rich ecosystem of hardware design that many people are exploring. The other big question we have is how do we integrate all of these hardware components in a way where we can avoid bottlenecks in data movement? Can we put the memories closer to where the compute are so that it doesn't take so long for the data to get routed from memory into the chip for compute? That tighter integration will be expensive potentially, will be more technically challenging, but it could give us much better performance profiles if we can manage that cost and manage the associated implications for power and heat. So I think those are the two things, custom chips for energy efficiency, and then advanced packaging and integration of these various chips into a coherent, tightly packaged system.
Yeah, in some ways, the systems design innovation is just starting to show up in our doorstep and could have really significant implications. Let's keep zooming out. So we had Professor Lee sort of help us look inside the chips and at the racks, and hopefully all the folks in the webinar are starting to build their own mental models here. What's going on? The chips are getting smaller. They're getting more powerful. As a result, the amount of heat over surface area is skyrocketing. So we've got cooling challenges, and that implicates water. Along come, GPUs. The game changes even more. But now let's step out and take the sort of much wider view. What's happening to the grid that these data centers need to plug into? What are the implications not just for businesses, but for consumers? It's really hard to turn on your TV these days and not hear about at least some theory of what is happening in the relationship between data centers and the bills that show up in people's mailboxes. So I want to turn to Serguei, who's been on the frontier of this line of inquiry. Serguei, we've seen the headlines of the data center builds facing local pushback. We've seen a tidal wave of public opinion and proposed legislation aimed at the rates. I've got a group of great colleagues at Penn, some former students of mine, digging into some of this sort of regulatory and legal foundation that's changing. A lot of interest in affordability and reliability implications. I'm curious what your research shows you to date. Are data centers the primary culprit behind these utility rates? How does the picture look differently depending on what part of the country you're looking at? And what's the difference between looking backwards at past build versus what might be on the horizon?
Great questions, Ali. So first, to kind of understand the scale of what we are facing, there are currently something like 1,800 active US data centers consuming something like 40 gigawatts of power capacity. They're spread over something like 180 utilities located in 43 US states. So it's pretty spread out on the surface of it, but the reality is that there is lots of concentration. Like you look at North Virginia, of course, and in North Virginia, we are already facing a situation where data centers can consume something like 20-25% of the entire power. If you just focus on hyperscalers, which are really, really big data centers consuming hundreds of megawatts, even gigawatts of power, what we are seeing is that there are about 500-600 of them already built and another 500-600 in the pipeline. So this is happening. This is real. This is not just fantasy. These centers will be built, and at the same time, if you look at residential electricity prices, you look at the last 5-6 years, from 2020 to 2025, you see that they increased about 32%, from about 13 cents per kilowatt hour to about 17 cents per kilowatt hour, which is not insignificant, which is why people are complaining. This is a big increase, 32%. But what we show is that very little of it is due to AI data centers. This residential price increase reflects many things like fuel and capacity costs, aging infrastructure in the United States that need to be maintained, transmission and distribution investments, extreme weather events, which are increasing rapidly in the last few years, and also raising cost of capital. To build all of this, you need to borrow, and it's increasingly more expensive to borrow money in the United States in the last few years. So data centers play a role in this increase, but very small role. On average, it's very, very tiny. In some states, where capacity that is added to the grid by AI data centers is significant, you can think of it as, in some instances, AI data centers may be responsible for something like 10% of overall price increase, but that's very rare. On average, it's almost insignificant. So, and unfortunately, public thinks it's AI data centers, but really it's not. There are many, 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 many factors. So that's kind of a quick response based on our study. So to kind of summarize, AI data centers explain only a small part of national price increase, but in a wrong territory, in a wrong utility territories, they can explain a small but a meaningful part of a local price increase. This is what I would say.
Yeah, that's really helpful to sort of unpack some of these other drivers. The price of natural gas really driving up rates, the backlog of decades of not upgrading our grid kind of hitting folks. And I think you've got some good insight to maybe inform how we think about some of the challenges looking forward as well, in addition to what's driving the challenge now. I'm curious, there's a rates conversation, and you gave us a good, I think, lay down, at least backward looking. When you look forward, let's say you're talking to a Fortune 500 company or a local utility provider, putting on your risk hat. What are the primary supply chains that sort of should keep them up at night from this sudden massive demand for power? And maybe bring the audience a little bit into this discussion around 24/7 continuous power as well, right? Data centers, Ben talked a little bit about the needs from inference and training and speed, but talk to us about this, sort of how 24/7 enters the
So certainly, one thing that is helpful to understand is that over the last 20 years, let's say from 2005 through 2020, US electricity demand grew by 0.1% annually. So it was super stable. And as a result, all of our grid, all of our supply chains that supply all kinds of equipment to utilities, they are built for this very, very stable demand. Now, what happened since 2020, last 5-6 years, demand has been growing at about 1.7% per year. So that's almost 20 times faster than the previous couple of decades. So that's what we are dealing with. We've been building our grid for a flat demand increase. And now we are suddenly living in a very, very different world where another 500 hyperscaler facilities are about to hit the market. So that creates lots of issues. We need to be developing infrastructure to serve those data centers faster, and we cannot, because you can build a data center relatively quickly. It's not that complicated. If you have the chips, if you have simple walls, you can put them up in a year maybe. But it will take you many, many years to build electrical infrastructure to supply this data center. So, for example, a large transformer now will take you 3 years to get. A gas turbine to convert gas into electricity will take you 4 to 6 years, because demand is insane and the supply is just not there. We were not kind of prepared to supply so many gas turbines. Transmission lines can take even longer because they need permitting, interconnection studies need to be included, and so on. And in general, to connect anything to the grid, you have to go into the interconnection queue and file all kinds of paperwork. And in certain states, it takes 10 years to just get connected, a facility which might be otherwise ready to connect it to the grid. So that's kind of a big regulatory issue. So utilities are kind of trapped between two risks. You move too slowly and the AI data centers can go somewhere else or develop their private generation, build a nuclear station or something like that and bypass utilities altogether. But if you move too quickly, then you can invest billions into infrastructure for a project that might arrive late or ramps up slower than predicted and so on, or never reaches its requested load. So that's kind of the big issue that utilities face and AI data centers face. The 24/7 issue is very important. The annual quantity of electricity that you need to supply for a data center is not the hardest problem. The hardest problem is serving the data center during a relatively small number of hours when the grid is already at its maximum stress. So imagine you have 7 p.m. on a hot summer day, you don't have the sun shining, so solar power is not there, but at the same time, there is a big shortage of electricity because everyone has their air conditioners on. God forbid the lightning strikes somewhere and part of the grid goes out. So during those critical hours, you need to have dispatchable generation, transmission capacity, whatever it is to keep AI data center running, because AI data centers need very, very high reliability. You need to do inference no matter what. And so the AI data center server load is relatively constant. You look at it, it kind of doesn't naturally disappear throughout the day. There are no kind of big peaks. So to summarize, kind of AI moves at the digital speed, but the grid moves at a very slow industrial speed. And so the greatest risk is building 30-year infrastructure that is serving us for a very long time around the 5-year forecast of AI data center growth. So that's a big challenge.
Yeah, that's a great insight. And I know that's a conversation folks are having around the country of, is there a stranded asset risk? Are we at risk of overbuilding? And I think it's helpful for people in the webinar, even though the four corners of the discussion is data centers, to keep in mind there are a bunch of other drivers for electrification and for power across the country. And when you think about especially a more automated set of sort of industrial capacities taking over the production of a lot more goods over time, the cost of electricity becomes a really significant competitive flex between countries. So definitely take everything Serguei sort of said, and that is, I think, informing the headlines, but inject into that some of that additional sort of macro. I want to sort of go from really high level to a little bit tighter around first just distributed systems and battery storage there, because that's just been such a big area of focus for you. And then also tell us a little bit of how do we think about both the implications of batteries and distributed systems for carbon and the environment, but also just what's happening in this broader conversation as potentially gas gets turned on harder, or folks are even talking about turning coal back on. How's that conversation playing out?
So if you look at the overall kind of a mismatch between demand and supply on the electrical grid right now, actually, on average, our electrical grid in the US is only 55% utilized. So there is still 45% of capacity, again, on average, not on those hot summer days locally somewhere, but on average, there is a lot of underutilized generation capacity. So the first response to this growing demand from AI data centers shouldn't be probably building new capacity, because it will take years. As I already mentioned, we are we have many bottlenecks in that supply chain. But trying to make use of this other 45% of the grid, that's the first natural response. So how do you do that? Well, you need to think of grid enhancing technologies. You need to think of sensors and dynamic line ratings, and you have to think about things like battery storage, which will allow you to store electricity for this couple of hours for hot summer day or for some kind of a disruption. And their value of these batteries is not necessarily in providing every megawatt hour data center consumes. It's just the value is in reducing demand during this handful of hours when the grid is most constrained. So that's kind of the way to think about it. And we see all kinds of interesting new business models emerging in this space. There is, of course, battery storage, which is the ones that we naturally think about, but there are all kinds of other storage technologies. There is thermal storage and piped hydro, and all kinds of other approaches. There is also, even with a battery storage, there are business models where you make batteries mobile and you charge them in one place when the price is low, and then you move the battery response. You respond to demand and you move the battery to another part of the grid, and you discharge it there. So all of these technologies are available. Some of them have been tested extensively in other countries, in UK, in Chile, and other parts of the world. So I think this is kind of where the focus should be now. Plus, of course, we have to think about virtual power plants, kind of a distributed energy resources. For example, utilities can aggregate household batteries that households put in place, electrical vehicles that can store energy, thermostat control, commercial loads, and backup systems into a virtual power plant that can be centrally coordinated by the utility. So, of course, location matters for that a lot. Time of the day matters. So even though on average we have plenty of supply in the grid, it's locally at a couple of times during the year that we need to have all of these responsive technologies available. So the grid does not need every data center to be flexible all the time. It needs some meaningful flexibility during a relatively small number of critical hours. And that's kind of another thing to think about. Can we work with data centers to probably move their loads proactively across the grid and make sure that demand and supply are balanced?
Yeah, that's so great. And I don't think everyone appreciates the roles that batteries can play. And you talked about one that I think is often under discussed, which is the ability of batteries to serve essentially as a transmission asset and decongest parts of the grid. I used to have this sort of my 4 Rs, which I'll use my moderator prerogative to diverge us for a second. But we whenever we talk about the grid, most people think about putting poles and wires in the ground, and that is essential. We must grow it. This is a platform technology for the future. But the first R in my mind is responsiveness. How do we help the grid be more responsive to these peaks and troughs that Sergei talked about? How do we help the users of big electricity load? What Ben was talking about, how do we let the hyperscalers and others play with that more effectively? So responsiveness. The second is resilience, right? When the grid buckles under the pressure of physical risks or other challenges, that throws everything off. And for that reason, people tend to feel like they need to overbuild to compensate for the lack of resilience, a rickety old system. So that's a place where we need to focus. And resilience can look like, drones doing overflights to make sure there's not too much buildup of, trees and potential fuel for fires and so on. So good vegetation management that's targeted and thoughtful. The third is rewiring. And Sergey talked about this, right? When he says grid enhancing technologies, people think, well, that could be a million things. What are grid enhancing technologies? Think about one thing that's really simple. Our grid currently, think about all these different lines, essentially have speed limits. How do we maybe raise the speed limit in certain places because we can actually move electrons faster? Or how do we increase the throughput by reconductoring the lines, add another lane to the highway? So I think that's an incredibly important set of tools that, again, I think policymakers, folks in the corporate space don't appreciate and can actually get you some of that early surge capacity faster. And then the final is this sort of repowering, right? Like there are all these places that are under optimized, but they are connected to the grid. How do we use those as the sort of backbone for resurgence? So really appreciate you walking through the sort of broad waterfront that you cover with your work. And I think it's just an important space for people to start connecting the dots between what's happening inside the data center, what's happening inside the rest of the economy. To take us to a little bit of a sort of different dimension, we've done the chips and the racks, we've done the data centers to the grid. We sort of opened up the environmental footprint conversation, social license issues. Govi, I want you to pull on some of those threads. I think you're incredibly well positioned given your career, solving for exactly some of these unintended consequences and scaling some of the important sustainability transitions. Let's start by digging into something that's come up a bunch of times in this conversation: heat, thermal management, cooling, which folks may not realize is a huge part of the energy budget for data centers. There's a massive shift happening right now from traditional air cooling, think of an AC, towards liquid cooling, evaporative water cooling, and some of what you're working on, passive. This has the potential to save heavily on electricity. It can have implications for water consumption. So curious if, given both what you're working on squarely, but then living in this ecosystem, tackling thermal management, walk us through these core technologies and the trade-offs that live between them.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Ali. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. You and Valerie kind of coordinating this. And actually, I'm thankful for Ben and Sergey to actually making the case for me already for heat management. Ben started off saying the co-location of these data centers and the high processing power of these chips and for AI driven, et cetera, is driving this tremendous heat generation. And Sergey talked about, heat as a huge issue driving grid overload, et cetera, as we try to cool, whether it's homes or now we're talking about data centers specifically. So I think the heat is a huge problem, and we in Phase Change have been looking at thermal management not to just draw away heat. Traditionally, air cooling worked well because the amount of heat was modest. So if you look back, I believe Sergey mentioned some of the stuff in Ben as well. At the enterprise level, the platform was enterprise, computers, circa 2010, for the last 10 years or so, maybe 3 to 8 kilowatt of rack power, if you take a look at that as an average. And then start looking at 2020, everyone was talking about cloud. Well, now you're talking about co-locating servers, and that increased the rack power to, I don't know, 10 to 20, maybe even a little higher kW. And today, where we're looking at AI-driven platforms, now we're already at 50 to 150 kW, and in about 5 years, because of the agentic AI and emerging AI, and we haven't even talked about robotics yet. So that's a whole different ball game when mobility comes into play. We're talking about anywhere from 250 to 600 kW as rack power. So just think about the amount of heat and what we have traditionally focused on. Just to give you a context, you just mentioned air conditioners. We've traditionally focused on taking heat away, dissipating it, and the question here is, or cooling the space with air, or even if it's refrigerants as an example. Moving air to cool like a 200 to 500 kW rack, system, that will need a tremendous amount of airflow. Think about the fans that you'll need to move that heat. Large pressure drops. We're also talking about cooling infrastructure, which is massive, has to be massive, and what we call this parasitic energy consumption, right? To cool this stuff. Well, what air has actually done is, I say, low heat capacity. So all of these power densities that's building up now, air becomes impractical. So industry in general over the last several years has moved away from air, and moved into liquid, which has got better thermal properties. So you asked about what are these, technologies and what's going on today. So in general, I'm going to paint a broad picture because there's lots of innovation happening in this space. It's some really spectacular innovation worldwide in liquid cooling options, right? So when you take a look at either a direct to chip, where you literally have heat taken away from the chip. So that's what we're focusing on. Take the heat away from the chip so it can keep the processing at the same level. Because the minute it hits a certain temperature, processing speed drops. You can't afford that. Especially, can you predict, when AI is going to be used more or less? Well, not yet. Eventually, we'll use AI to do that. For right now, it's 24/7, as you just said earlier. So how do we actually control the temperature? So the direct-to-chip cooling is one where we can start looking at cold plates. They use cold plates that sit directly on these GPUs that Ben talked about before, or CPUs for that matter. And what currently the industry uses is a water glycol mix that circulates, through these plates, and you take that heat away. Maybe 70 to 90% of that server heat gets taken away from that. So that's the direct-to-chip part of it. The second aspect where people are using liquid is, well, immersion cooling, and immersion cooling has multiple levels of immersion cooling. Like, you have 1 part, 2 part systems where the whole server are submerged in a dielectric fluid, right? So no electrical conductivity, a lot of thermal conductivity. Of course, here there's no water contacts in the electronics. It's completely sealed, and there is no air cooling inside the server. So the whole server is immersed in liquid. And then you mentioned also the other cooling technologies that are being looked at, which is evaporative cooling. Here we use water, and instead of mechanically using water, then it's be chill. So evaporation of the water takes that heat away, and then it condenses again later on, and you can recycle that back in. However, that's this water that evaporates, and there's energy that's taken away from that. That's heat that's taken away from that, and by virtue of that, now we have to use a lot of water. Now, this is what people get concerned about. So how do we educate people? So I will talk about that later on as we go down the path about is this all hype, or is it happening really? There's lots of innovation happening. Now, let me just give you a little bit of pros and cons, to some degree. If you look at liquid cooling options, all of these are better than air. And I want to caveat, early on, there is no one single best solution. We have to look at a systems enterprise, systems design level, where we are having combination. We need to design a combined system where we're using some liquid, some air, but also other systems as we look at heat recovery. So in liquid cooling options, you have excellent thermal performance. Obviously, you're not using much fan power. You can have higher rack density and a lower PoE. So you're talking about power utilization can be highly efficient. In some of these liquid cooling options. Now, with some of the pros for direct-to-chip cooling, when you're using a fluid, you have opportunities for heat recovery. I'll come back to that in a second, because instead of just focusing on taking heat away and cooling the chip, we have to start thinking about, oh my God, heat is a resource. Can we reuse it? And I believe Sergei mentioned this idea about mobile units and heat recovery. It's storage, energy storage. So thermal storage now becomes an amazing capability for us, and that's what we do in phase change. And I'll talk about that in a second. But before that, we'll talk about immersion cooling. Some of the benefits: you can cool a 200 kW to a 500 kW, quietly. There is no noise. Of course, this is submerged. There's very little energy used for fans in this case, and very good, excellent thermal conductivity, right? So also uniformity of thermodynamics is very high in this immersion cooling. And with evaporative cooling, you have very little electrical consumption. It's also very efficient in dry climates, just because of where evaporative cooling happens because of evaporation. And it's lower use of compressor. So energy use in general is good for an evaporative cooling. It's probably the best among all liquid cooling capabilities. However, we are compensating by using more water. So the question is a trade-off, which is, and today's, if you look at the rhetoric and what people are concerned about, it's not just energy, it's also water. And this is where a lot of the hype is there, and where is the water used, how it's used. And then if you look at the trade-offs, with liquid cooling, so direct to chip, you have a capital cost, you have to redesign systems, some complex plumbing required. However, not insurmountable. There are companies that are doing some amazing innovation. We're working with some of them. We've partnered with some world industry leaders who are looking at design systems where not the entire facility, even at the rack level, at the system design, where they have these, heat units that take away heat. It doesn't matter whether it's a small server, it's a large GPU, or an entire system itself, or a data center. In immersion cooling, there are specialized server designs that are because you need to make sure that you're good fluid management. Servicing becomes a little bit of a challenge. And the supply chain here is still developing, and I think Sergey talked a little bit about the challenge here is not about having power today, it's having power today when we need it. I think, Sergey, you mentioned we are at a 55% grid utilization. That's great. The issue for us is when is it available? So when the grid is overloaded, utilities struggle. So they have to get, fire off new plants or new energy. So if you have that distributed generation and storage, that becomes useful. We are in North Carolina, one of the places with lots of Duke Energy doing a lot of good things in here. We had to wait 18 months for a electrical panel, just a panel, to increase power to our manufacturing. So just think about it, if you're looking at data centers, 5-10 years wait time, just because, of course, now you throw in all the global geopolitical issues there's a long lead time. So we have to start very quickly thinking about distributed power. How do we manage the distributed power and storage, which becomes now a very good resource for us? So that's part of what I want to talk about is thermal storage, not just electrical energy, but thermal storage is doable today. We've been doing it. We've been supplying customers today where they can take that heat, store it, and then recall it when they want it. Think about using every GPU, every data center now becomes a power plant. That is significant. So, which is part where phase change comes in handy, where we make products, and going into the overview, that's where the energy saving or the thermal energy storage options now becomes a viable almost immediately as we build infrastructure down the road. Today, we can offer solutions where power plants become, efficient.
Gotti, we just got a question from the audience, and I'll just
Go ahead.
live fire to you.
Okay.
Where are some of these technologies in terms of technology readiness level? Department of Energy measures it 0 through 9, but just how do you think about cold plates, immersion, evaporative, thermal storage? How do you think about them in the commercialization process?
Good question. Great question. Direct to chip cold plates, that's actually in vogue today. That's being installed as we speak. It's making thermal management possible for a lot of the hyperscalers, as we talked about. So this is not a future. This is today. It's innovation that's happened. It's happening today. We're increasing materials. In fact, we are participating in that with a large players. Immersion cooling is I probably, if you take a look at scale, it's coming along. The supply chain there is a little bit more challenged because now you're talking about electrical conductivity versus thermal conductivity, and how do you actually insulate? So the risk is higher, the cost is higher, so people are a little bit more wary. So there is an implementation. So immersion cooling is probably a little farther down the road. It's happening at a much slower pace, largely because of the design capabilities that needed, the servicing aspect of it, which is being understood there. Again, it is happening in small pockets, not as rapidly as the direct to chip. Evaporative cooling is doable today. The challenge is water, use of water, where data center companies are facing a lot of resistance from local communities and saying using up water. So that's where the rub is for evaporative cooling. Evaporative cooling has been in vogue for years. It's not a new technology. There's some innovation in terms of system design. However, it's when you scale this at a hyperscale level, now you're talking about not going from evaporative cooling for a single room or a building. Now you're talking about massive data centers where the use of water is significant.
Yeah.
So that's kind of
And
did that answer the
and
question? Yeah.
I want to on the water usage part, and that's been triggering a lot of pushback on the ground. Um, One of the questions we got from the audience was, "What are the?" And you take a shot at this, and then I'll maybe bring the rest of the panel back for a live fire here. Um, but what are the pollution issues that data centers are or should be concerned about associated with the water? So there's the using too much, or putting too much strain on the public utility. But are there other factors that you're tracking?
When you say pollution, I mean this the with evaporative cooling, Ali, a big aspect of that is just the inefficiency of using a lot of water. So there's no water from a pollution perspective. It's more just usage
Yeah,
which is significant. So I'll let
but
Ben
but
and
there
Sergey
isn't sort
talk.
of an industrial discharge dimension to the cooling system necessarily. I think maybe what the audience is aiming at is when you actually do the construction, there can be a lot of impairment to water. So maybe that's what the audience member is talking about. But
There is,
let's
yeah. And just to wrap that up, there are technologies, there are companies there that have been working on water cleaning, water purification, that we have gotten that down to a science. I mean, there are global corporations that do an amazing job of getting water back in. It's the quantity of water. It's that, oh my God, you're taking water away from
yeah,
drinking water, agriculture, etc. That becomes a huge concern. So Ben Sergey can probably comment on that as well.
yeah, that's great. Um, uh, Professor colleagues, you're welcome to comment on that, or and we have some questions still coming in, but I have one for all of you while we wait for additional question formation. Just like maximum one sentence. Govi touched on this: robots, aka physical AI. How many years until that changes the game on what we think of as the needs to support the AI economy in terms of infrastructure? So maybe we'll start with Ben, Sergey, Gavi, but just how many years till that's the new demand changing the physical infrastructure here? You will not be held to this.
I would say 10 to 15.
Yeah.
10 to 15.
Sergey,
Yeah, I think more like 5 to 10.
Gavi, you're more bullish or less bullish on this?
Actually, a little bit more bullish. I would say phase one is happening now as
Hmm.
AI builds models. Phase two is in the next 5 years, and 5 to 7 years is phase three when physical AI actually becomes the infrastructure with robots building buildings, repairs, etc. So I'm a little bit more bullish as I've seen robots take over a lot of the infrastructure building.
That's great. That's great. Um, Another thing that folks have raised on the Q&A side is just impacts on the ground that are not electricity or water. Um, there's, I think, concern around noise. There's concern about impacts on farming and other sort of competing uses, animal reproductivity. There's a whole sort of suite of issues like that. Um, who's studying that? And are we devoting enough time to looking at those intersections with um, society? I know that's something I spend a little bit of time doing personally, but I'm curious if others are looking at that and if you've come across really creative solutions along the way.
I think the broader impacts, the broader environmental impacts of data centers have been posited by or proposed by quite a few people. And I think getting more hard data on the actual impacts is an open research question. I think Sergey has done a really great amount of work because there's a narrative and then there's actual quantitative analysis that needs to be done. One of the things that I've seen in this space has been on, well, two things, I guess. Noise pollution. Depending on how you cool the data center, you will have lots of fans moving air, right? And depending on how you do acoustic insulation for the data center, then maybe there's a concern about not. So there's probably best practice, and then there's probably some developer that is building a data center for the first time and causing a lot of noise pollution for their local neighbors. So sorting that out and figuring out what the design space for data centers looks like, and then figuring out where to be in the optimal part of that space is going to be important. The other thing I'd say is that on air pollution, in addition to noise pollution, there's been this discussion about building a data center might contribute particulate matter into the local community. I think that usually is based on diesel generators being built next to the data center, and then looking at permitting applications to run those data centers at some worst case scenario. In practice, you're probably having huge problems if you're powering a data center with diesel backup for hours at a time. So I think the air pollution piece, again, needs further quantification, further study. I'm not saying that the air pollution piece is not a problem, because I know that there are some hyperscalers that are jury rigging gas turbines and trying to power their data centers that way. But I think there are these issues that need to be studied at a lot more depth.
Yeah, and I think that part of the reason why at Penn we prioritize some of the interdisciplinary work is so that figuring out how we can take the technology innovations and actually make them more of the market rather than just what we could do if we wanted to get it right. We're at 1 minute out. I'll just take us out of outer space here because one of our audience members wants this. And I know some of you have spent more time than I would have guessed thinking about it. So last question for our panel: what will happen first? The first commercial data center launched into space, or the 10th data center launched on the ocean? All of the issues we've been talking about are data centers in our backyard. This maybe blows up the paradigm. So we'll just go around the horn, Govi, Sergei, and then Ben, who is my personal favorite expert on space data centers, for anyone who wants to follow up.
Yeah, so Ali, just to start us off in there, I believe the 10th commercial underwater data center is much more likely to arrive before the first commercial orbital data center. It probably already has, maybe it's happening somewhere in the world. That'll probably definitely happen faster because that's already in play so far.
Sergei?
Yeah, I agree there, but I also want to say that both of those kind of directions are somewhat distractions from immediate problems we have of connecting terrestrial data centers without damaging affordability and reliability and so on.
That's great.
Yeah, agree with both panelists. I think the oceans, tidal power, cooling, there are advantages there. Space is just hard. I think it's an amazing research question, but production facility, that's going to be hard.
Yeah.
Well, fantastic. I'm glad we started out with chips. We went to racks. We went to the data centers themselves. We went to the grid and the economy, and then we launched into outer space. So really appreciate folks joining us on the journey here. Valerie and the Mack team, really appreciate you getting us on the platform. And folks should feel free to follow up with us if you want to continue the conversation.